A new investigation co-published by ProPublica is taking a look at how the cost of a college came at the expense of those who were not able to attend the institutions they were helping to build. Erasing the black spot, how a Virginia college expanded by uprooting a black neighborhood, chronicles how a middle-class black neighborhood in Newport News, Virginia was taken over through the power of eminent domain. Back in the 60s, families pushed out of their homes and offered less than what their properties were worth to build what would become Christopher Newport University, a school that today has a black undergraduate population of around 6%. Live for us this morning, Brandi Kellam, the lead reporter on the story with the Virginia Center for Investigative Journalism at WHRO. Also Lewis Hansen, an editor at the nonprofit news group. Thank you both for giving us some time this morning on a fascinating story on a lot of levels. Brandi, let's start with you. Black residents were forced to sacrifice their homes, of course, for predominantly white institutions. Where ultimately did that leave these families?
Yeah, thank you, Rob, for having us on this morning. So ultimately, it left those families displaced and scattered throughout the city. You know, what we know by our reporting is that in the 1960s, this was a black community that had been around since the late 1800s. So you're thinking about 80 years of establishing a stronghold in this area in Newport News. By the 1960s, what was a farming community then became was up-and-coming middle-class community. And what ultimately happened was the residents who were aspiring to live to the middle-class standard that was growing and developing ended up having to scatter and go elsewhere. So it severely limited their resources and their lack of opportunities.
And Lewis, this is a story about many things, including housing discrimination. Can you speak to the use of eminent domain here? Break it down in layman's terms, and how and when government bodies choose to use it, and is that use now on the rise?
Eminent domain is an incredibly powerful tool for the government. Essentially, the low bar that governments have to hurdle is this a public good? And if it's a public good, then they can go to court and take a property. This was widespread for urban renewal in the 50s and 60s. What we found was that colleges and universities and that expansion at that time was really driven by eminent domain use. Basically, a government, usually a city or their housing authority, would have to come through and say, this neighborhood is blighted. There's something wrong with it. And that was enough to go to the courts and take the property and pay essentially what the city wanted to pay for it. So it was a very strong tool, and lots of people were given the choice of either sell or we're going to take it from you.
And that is just to follow up on that a little bit, because it presents such a dilemma. I mean, most people in general support the idea of development. There's a new business or a new housing complex or a new school coming in that tends to be good for the community, tends to be good for the tax base. I get all that. But how do communities, how do governments strike then the balance of those who have to be displaced in order to achieve what they call a greater good? Or is it possible to do both, take care of the incoming and the outgoing?
I think there's a greater balance, and I think there's a move toward. Sorry, go ahead, Brandi.
Yeah, Brandi, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I'm just topping off what Lou said earlier. Yeah, I think that there is that debate right now happening, and that debate has been happening since eminent domain was heavily used, as Lou said, in the 1950s and 60s to, take on this new development in all these various cities across the country, which, was deemed the high point of urban renewal in our country. I think that many will argue that many communities, like minority communities and underserved communities and Black communities and communities of color, have felt the brunt of that because of the lack of access to resources that would allow them to fight these type of takings by local government. I think people would agree that urban renewal and the improvement of a community would be great for an entire community at large. But what we found in our reporting is that this community and a lot of Black communities across the country have paid the price more than others for this development in their area. And in the Christopher Newport story, Christopher Newport, just to give you an example, is a college in the central part of the city. The city is a mixed race city of about 40% white and Black, but the student population of Black students is just 7%. So even though the argument back in the 1960s was that everyone could benefit from this, even the Black residents during a time of segregation in our country, we see today that that really didn't play out in real time.
And Louis, back over to you for a response to that.
Yeah, I think trying to balance what is good for the whole community versus the impacts of what happens in a smaller community has been very difficult. And our story wanted to look at what the long-term implications of taking a stable, established Black middle-class neighborhood and basically taking it part by part by part and whittling it down to just 5 neighborhoods now. It has great impact on the remaining homeowners, but it's also a psychological disruption. It's taking people's churches, it's taking their homes, it's taking their community away from them, and that's a very high price to pay. And it's not always figured in when the government wants to build a new college or a new football stadium. It's something that I think deserves a lot more attention.
It's a high price to pay, to your point, and also worth noting, I think, as Brandi did a second ago, it's the same kinds of folks who are paying that price. The pain is not spread. Certain communities become riper targets than others for one reason or another. Brandi, before we go, just talk about kind of what you hope is the main takeaway for people who are interested in this story, and how you think it has ramifications even today, what the main ripple effect has been and what you hope people can learn.
Yeah, I think what I hope people can learn is actually what I learned is that when you look at cities and you see urban pockets that are high crime and high poverty, there are reasons for that. And these reasons can date back to the 1950s and 60s when cities enacted urban renewal policies to improve cities, but actually negatively impacted some of their citizens who did not have the resources to fight those types of takings. I think the other thing is just that, this story shows and sheds light on conversations that we're having in the country today about critical race theory and reparations. And, I think that this is a point in case that shows how a timeline has existed for this community that has been negatively impacted by various systemic challenges, from their property being taken and seized by the city council members to legal battles that they tried to fight later on. And you can see over a 60-year time period that each system they went up against was able to defeat them. They were defeated by those systems, and it shows how systemically a community can be demolished and diminished by legal actions and various policies that exist today. So I hope people take away that this is a way to showcase how systemic racism and reparations and the conversations we have in our country are challenges and conversations that we should be having, and that hope they look at this story as an opportunity to understand those conversations that we're currently talking about today.
Contained to Virginia. This happens all over the country. And again, uprooting a Black neighborhood to build a college that, as we speak, as you said, only ended up being 6 or 7% Black decades later, kind of encapsulates the problem. Brandi, Louis, thank you both for your time and for your reporting. Appreciate you spending part of your morning with us. We'll be right back.